I'm Alicia Barnes, and I am currently enrolled in the Morningside College of Education. The research that I conducted is the relationship between grouping styles and reading comprehension in the 9th grade English class. One reason that I decided to conduct this type of research is some of the problems across the nation were reading scores across the nation for 12th grade students declined from 292 in 1992 to 287 in 2015. Another alarming problem that we have in the States is 43% of Americans did not have reading skills in order to be successful in the workforce. As a teacher, I was always curious about which type of grouping worked best. I also had many teachers share their opinions on both sides. I had teachers who would argue for mixed ability and teachers who would argue for similar ability. And so I really wanted to know which type of grouping would work best for students. Some of the early interventions for reading comprehension was the RTI, which improved reading scores. So what this study suggested was as students are having post-assessments or pre-assessments, and they found that if a student was in the Tier 2, to put students directly into the Tier 2 RTI pyramid instead of starting students out at Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And so they found that reading comprehension improved if you met the student or you put the student in which tier they were actually at. Self-monitoring also was an intervention to reading comprehension, and what this study suggested was it followed 3 special education students, and they were able to raise their reading comprehension as they self-monitored their own comprehension. Again, there's some limitations to that study since it was such a small sample size. Also, another study suggested that teaching directly reading strategies would help comprehension, such as summarizing or finding key ideas or using context clues to figure out vocabulary words. It is clear that collaboration among peers is important to learning, and so some of the collaborative interventions which have been done in the past is having expectations in the collaborative setting. So instead of putting students in a group and just having them talk about a question, actually having each member of that group assigned a role actually helps their learning. Also, it was found that collaboration and reading had a positive effect. What I focused on for this presentation is the positives of both mixed ability and similar ability. So for the mixed ability, there's many who argue that exposure to a diverse group of peers was really important for students. Students also seem to enjoy group learning instead of sitting and listening to the teacher lecture for 40 minutes. Also, there was a lot of studies that showed that lower achieving students learn from having the higher achieving or average achieving students in their group because they learn from their role models. Burke and Sass has a 10-30-60 rule, which I thought was interesting. So when you're dealing with grouping of mixed ability, this rule suggests that you put 10% of your lower achievers in the group, 30% of your average achievers, and 60% of your higher achievers. For similar ability grouping, those people argue that students feel more comfortable when they are grouped with similar academic peers. Also, the students felt like they were able to express themselves more if they were in the similar ability. Teachers could also design lessons specifically for each group. So if I had a group of higher achieving students, I could find more challenging curriculum for them, and lower achieving students, you would be able to create interventions that would help those students move them to proficient. Another positive for similar ability is students were able to challenge each other. Again, grouping of students could be done in multiple different ways. Most of the research I found talked about how, for similar ability, talked about how higher achievers students should be in one group, lower achieving students in another, but it could also be based on academic, gender, or learning style. The social cognitive theory was Vygotsky's idea, and he suggested that students learn in social contexts, and perhaps students working in groups help students with their reading comprehension. Again, if students are discussing a piece of literature, my assumption was that students would have a higher reading comprehension. Social interaction is also important to the cognitive development of students. My purpose statement is the purpose of this study was to observe the relationship between grouping styles, mixed ability grouping, and similar ability grouping, and reading comprehension. So currently, there is a lack of research on how different types of ability grouping affects the reading comprehension. Research has also, it seems to focus a lot more on like social emotional and not necessarily the academic outcome of students. I hypothesized that lower achieving students would benefit from mixed ability grouping and not similar ability, and that higher achieving students would benefit from similar ability grouping and not mixed ability grouping. So my independent variable was the grouping of students, and my dependent variable was the measures of the learning outcome on the post-assessments, and I used Jamestown Readers. This is quantitative research used to determine the impact of mixed ability and similar ability grouping and reading comprehension. Group work is important for students to continue to practice. Although there is no significant data to support which grouping was benefit for reading comprehension, it was clear that reading comprehension did help students feel more engaged during the study. How I went about conducting this study, I had 42 participants in 2 English 9 classes. They were of a diverse population. They consisted of Caucasians, Pacific Islanders, Hispanic, Native American, and Black students. I had 19 students in the controlled class, and I had 23 students in the experimental class. My measurement tool was the Jamestown reading probes, and I used the probes at the 9th grade reading level since I have freshmen. Jamestown Readers were designed to help teachers and students become more successful at reading comprehension to meet the guidelines of the No Child Left Behind Act. I also used Elements of Literature, which is the literary anthology that our school curriculum uses, and there was also other curriculum within the class. I gave every student a pre-assessment in the control and experimental class, and they were both the same assessment at the beginning of the 10-week period. For the controlled group, which was my similar ability, I grouped them together. If they had 10, I grouped the 10s together, I grouped the 9s together, I grouped the 7 and 8s together. And so I tried to stay within 2 points of their pre-assessment scores. For the experimental group, I wanted to mirror the 10-60-30 rule. And so based on their pre-assessments on the reading probes, I tried to put 10% not proficient in a group, 60% who were above proficient in a group, and 30% who were average in the group. The data analysis, I took reading probes. I gave students another probe after 10 weeks, and they were given a different reading probe that was still at the 9th grade level. The results are the independent T-scores, and I collected again the pre- and post-assessments. And so if you follow the table, the P-score for the pre-assessments was 0.345, and the post-assessments was 0.883. And if you note below that my P value should have been less than 0.05 to show a statistical difference. And so, going back, overall findings cannot exclude chance from any likely difference between the control and experimental group. Thus, the hypothesis was not confirmed. And so, however, if you look at the means of the pre- and post-assessments on this figure, you can see that on the pretest of the controlled group, which was the similar ability, did not really have an effect at all. But the pretest for the experimental, which was the mixed ability, the mean did raise a little bit on the post-assessment. So the social cognitive theory can help students learn. Again, if you look back at the figure, you can tell that it didn't harm students to be in groups. And in the mixed abilities, there was a few more students who moved up in their post-assessment. So again, mixed ability did have a small amount of advantages, but still it did not have a statistical difference. It is clear that peer helping and motivation can help students. There may not be a better way to group students, but ensuring that students are able to work in their peers at some point in the classroom, I think, is important for teachers to understand. It gives the students a break from listening to the teachers, and they're also able to talk about their own ideas about a certain text. For educators, the implication was to ensure there's group work during class time because, again, even though there's no statistical data, the data didn't go backwards. And so having students work in a group is not going to harm them. Also, I think it's important to note that probably having students work in a mixed ability and similar ability based on the objectives that the teacher would like the students to learn would be very important. So there were a few limitations. The obvious ones was the short amount of time. This was only a 10-week trial period. Also, time limitations. Some of my mixed ability grouping, since I had the 10-30-60 rule, sometimes if a student was absent, then those students didn't get the time as the similar ability or other groups to work with their peers. Also, the small sample size, there was only 42 students in the study. The reading material used in the study for the curriculum wasn't always at a 9th grade reading level, whereas the probes used from the Jamestown readers were at a 9th grade level. Also, I went back and forth with the reading probes. I used 2 different reading probes, and again, they were the same questions. So the reading probes always asked more general questions, and then they got to key ideas and what was taking place in the story. But I used 2 different ones, and so if a student had background knowledge about one story and answered the questions, they could have done better on that test than if they read the second probe and they didn't necessarily have the background to understand that. I did think about using the same probe for the pre and the post, but I decided against it. Students could have discussed the story after they took the pre-assessment, and so that might have skewed the data a little bit. Also, as every teacher is reflective, there are times when I had my mixed ability grouping at the beginning of the day and my similar ability towards the end of the day. Oftentimes, I change my lesson throughout the day based on how students respond to my lessons. And so, if my morning classes didn't go so well with my instruction, sometimes I changed the lesson a little bit to ensure that students in the later classes were engaged more. So not having the same teaching lesson could also have impacted the results. There's definitely the need for further research in this area. Again, more research on both mixed ability and similar ability and reading comprehension, I think, would be needed. And again, much of the research that I read focused on students' emotional and social learning and not necessarily the reading comprehension. Recent research on ability grouping and reading comprehension is what is needed then. And here are my references for the presentation. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.